Now let's talk about the morphology of bones, meaning what are their shapes and what is the arrangement of all the different structures or parts of bones. And we'll mainly look at long bones. These are your classic bone shapes that are found in your arms and legs. And the first thing we want to do is make sure we don't have to say, oh, bones have a middle part and then the end parts. Instead, for end parts, we can say epiphyses. Epi meaning on top. So these are the parts that are on the top and bottom ends of the bone. Epiphyses. They have compact bone on the outside, but much of the interior is all spongy bone. And this is where you would find a lot of red bone marrow is mixed in with that spongy bone in the epiphyses of long bones. Now, as you travel down the epiphyses, you'll eventually get to a region where you can find either an epiphyseal plate or an epiphyseal line. And the question is, are you looking at a kid's bone or an adult bone? In a kid, I'm talking like an early embryo all the way up to an adolescent, their long bones are still lengthening. So this epiphyseal plate is found in kids. It's also called a growth plate. It's basically a chunk of cartilage and it's constantly growing. And as the cartilage grows, it gets replaced with bone. And then more cartilage grows and that gets replaced with bone. And that's making the long bone grow at both ends simultaneously. But once you're an adult and your long bones stop growing, you have what's called an epiphyseal line. It's just going to be a thin remnant of where that growth plate fused and is now totally inactive. Just a thin line of compact bone. Okay, so now we know something about the ends of the bone. What about that middle part or shaft of the bone? That's called the diaphysis. So you have an epiphysis, and a diaphysis. This has got a lot of compact bone, although there is a tiny bit of spongy bone in there. The biggest feature of the diaphysis is the medullary cavity. So these long bones are hollow. If you crack them open, there is a space. It's lined with spongy bone, but smushed in with the spongy bone is bone marrow. If you're a kid, this is going to be red bone marrow, like a very young infant that's making a bunch of blood and growing very rapidly. But as you age, the red bone marrow will transition to yellow bone marrow, which we use to store fat. Something else we want to take note of is that on the ends of the long bones, you'll have what's called articular cartilage. Now, these bones don't have any cartilage, so I'll just draw some on. But in the image, you can see that there will be some hyaline cartilage on the ends of the bone to protect them from friction at the location of these joints. By the way, this term articulation just means a joint. So articular cartilage is always found at joints. Okay, so now we've got our bone and different parts of the bone, but there are membranes around the bone. The periosteum goes around the perimeter of the bone, or just the entire outside part of the bone. So, it's really just like a layer of connective tissue. It has a bunch of blood vessels running through it, and it has nervous tissue running through it as well. Because as we talked about briefly at the start of the last video, bones are dynamic. There's stuff going on. They're always changing. They're living organs. So they need a blood supply and they have sensation, innervation embedded in this periosteum. There's also an endosteum, so an inner membrane lining the medullary cavity. So if you were to crack open a bone and dig out the bone marrow, you would still have, you could see the spongy bone, but there would be this very thin membrane covering or lining the top of that spongy bone. It also lines the central canals of the osteons, very thin layer. So I think that's everything. It goes fast, but it adds up quick. So if you were to take a look at this adult femur, see if you can name all these different parts. Maybe you can print this out or something and practice with it. Let me tell you how I would tackle this, roughly in the order we just studied these parts. I would want to make sure I start by naming the epiphyses and the diaphysis, the ends and the shaft of the bone. And then I would want to not forget about that articular cartilage on the ends of the bone. Then there's that epiphyseal line. If it's an adult, remember this we said is an adult femur, so there'll be an epiphyseal line. It's just this little fused growth plate. It's not active anymore. It's just a thin strip of compact bone left behind from where we used to lengthen our bones. The other big thing about bones is compact bone versus spongy bone, right? So that's what I would probably tackle next. And I would want to look and say, where is compact bone? Compact bone is lining the whole outer part of this bone. So there's compact bone, lots of different places. The spongy bone is also in a lot of different places. Here's a lot of spongy bone in the epiphysis. And while you're at it, anytime you're talking about spongy bone, it's a good time to ask yourself, what do we call those little thin fibers of bone in spongy bone? Those are trabeculae. Now the thing is that spongy bone will always have marrow in it. So there's marrow, red bone marrow in the epiphyses of an adult, yellow bone marrow in the diaphysis. Because all of this is spongy bone too. Remember, spongy bone lines the medullary cavity. And then if you've got all that done, all we need to finish with are the membranes of the bone. Periosteum is the outer layer, and then the endosteum is lining the spongy bone. Now, of course, things get a little tricky. Like imagine on an exam or something, you've got a bone like this and there's an arrow and it says, what is this? Well, that's part of the diaphysis. More specifically, it looks like maybe the medullary cavity, but medullary cavity is lined with endosteum, and it has spongy bone, and spongy bone is made of trabeculae. So you have to look very carefully at diagrams like this and make sure you know what you're studying. In other words, make sure you realize that there's spongy bone all through the epiphysis, but also lining the medullary cavity. And the bone marrow is mixed in with the spongy bone, and the endosteum is lining that chamber. And just to make sure you have a good understanding of red bone marrow versus yellow bone marrow, the functions are obviously very different in that red bone marrow makes blood cells. And this process is called hematopoiesis. We'll talk about it more when we study blood, but it just means blood cell production. Not red blood cells, all blood cells, white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, and so on. And there'll be a lot of red bone marrow when you're younger, and then less as you become an adult. In an infant smaller than 1 year, just about the whole skeleton is stuffed with red bone marrow. But as you become an adult, it's found only in fewer parts of your body. Yellow bone marrow, we said, is found in adults for fat storage, although in cases of anemia, when you have reduced oxygen carrying capacity and your body decides to make more blood to deal with that, your yellow bone marrow can revert and become red bone marrow again. Next, we'll look at the anatomy of skeletal elements. What we really mean here is just this. 1, what are the other shapes of bone besides long bone? And 2, what do we call all the bumps and ridges on bones and all the passages through bone? So first, let's look at bone shapes. We've already talked about long bones. So long bones are long and slender, they have epiphyses and a diaphysis, and then I list some of the different long bones in your body, like the humerus and the femur. But now let's start up top here with these sutural bones. Uh, the articulations between the bones of your skull form sutures. So they're kind of these wavy lines at the joints between those bones. But here's a weird thing that can happen. As the bones join up with each other at that suture line, you may accidentally make a little separate, tiny little bone, just a random little chunk of a sutural bone as the joints are formed. So my sutural bones aren't going to look anything like your sutural bones. They're just a random little chunk. That's why when we talk about how many bones are in the human body, we say 206-ish, because I don't know how many sutural bones you have or exactly where they are or what shape they are. They're formed within that suture line. Pneumatized bones have air pockets. If you get work done on your car or new tires put on and you hear those drills, you know that noise? Those are pneumatic drills. They use air pressure. So pneumatized is referring to that air pockets. Short bones are little box-like bones found in your wrist and ankles. So we call those carpal bones and tarsal bones, using our Unit 1 terminology. Irregular bones are some of those bones with a very irregular shape. They often have short ridges or flat areas, notches, and so on. And some of our skull bones are very irregular in shape, but also vertebrae are good examples of irregular bones. Other skull bones are pretty simple, just flat, thin bones, and we just call those flat bones. Or I call them spongy bone sandwiches because they have compact bone on top, compact bone below, and spongy bone inside of the sandwich. We talked about long bones, so that leaves our last type of bone, which is a sesamoid bone. Sesamoid bones are these small little round bones, and they develop inside of tendons. The patella is a sesamoid bone. You know, it's articulating with other bones in your leg, right? It makes a joint there, but it's really embedded deep in a tendon. And so we all have kneecaps, but some of us may have other sesamoid bones, especially within our wrists. And this is another reason why we have 206-ish bones. I don't know what you got going on with your sesamoid bones. I don't even know what I've got going on with my sesamoid bones. So 206 is about how many bones you have. Keep an eye on these sutural bones. People really tend to forget about sutural bones and sesamoid bones. But you really do want to be able to name all 7 of these bone shapes and an example of that bone shape. We'll finish with looking at some bone features. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the different features on bone and the passages through bone. You can try to define these different features before you study them, meaning we'll learn about a lot of these openings. So a sinus is different than a meatus, and a fissure is different than a canal and a foramen. You know, some of these are round and some are elongated and so on. So this terminology is here if you want to study it, but there's quite a lot. You know, what's a tubercle, what's a tuberosity, what's a trochanter, and so on. Personally, I found it much easier to just dive in to the bones and the parts of bones and start to actually see and name some of these structures on the bone. I never learned to define these, meaning a spine being a pointed process, but I can name all the spines on all the bones in the body, which I find to be much more useful. So you can take a look through this. It's just going to prime you for the next couple of videos where we dive into the skeleton and all the specific parts on the skeleton.